Hello, everyone, and welcome to Whispered Abyss. Relax, settle in, and get ready as we dive into tonight's story. Let the darkness take you, and let's begin. The ocean was black that night, a vast rolling abyss swallowing the moonlight. Serena adjusted the radio dial, listening to the static crackle aboard her small fishing boat, the Marlin. She wasn't supposed to be here, miles off the coast, alone. But the sea called her, as it always did. This time, it whispered promises of fortune, an uncharted fishing ground full of bounty. "Serena, you're crazy," her brother's voice had echoed in her mind as she left the harbor. "No one goes out that far. Not alone. It's cursed." She had laughed it off then, but now, as the inky waves sloshed against her hull, his words lingered uneasily. Serena flipped the dial again, hoping for a weather update, when the static abruptly stopped. "Help!" The single word made her freeze. It wasn't a clear broadcast, but garbled and low, like it came from beneath the waves. "Who's there?" she stammered, leaning into the speaker. A long pause. Then the voice returned, more distorted, like a chorus of whispers. "The depths. Take. All." The hairs on Serena's arms stood on end. She turned the radio off and shook her head. It was probably just interference, a trick of the frequencies. But then she saw it. A faint light under the water, far ahead of the boat. It pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat, drawing her gaze. She leaned over the railing, her breath catching in her throat. The light wasn't a reflection. It was coming from beneath the waves, and it was getting closer. The temperature dropped sharply, her breath now visible in the air. Serena grabbed a flashlight and shone it over the water. The beam sliced through the dark, but the light below grew brighter, illuminating the surface. Something was down there. Before she could move, the light stopped just beneath her boat, and the water stilled unnaturally. No waves, no sound. Just silence. Then a hand, pale, skeletal, and webbed, slapped onto the side of the boat. Serena stumbled backward, her flashlight clattering to the deck. The boat rocked as another hand, identical to the first, gripped the railing. The pale fingers curled with impossible strength, peeling back the edge of the metal like it was tin foil. Her instincts screamed run, but her legs refused to move. She reached for the emergency flare gun stowed in her pack. Her fingers fumbled as she loaded a cartridge, her eyes glued to the railing. The thing hauled itself up. At first, it looked human. Long, spindly limbs and a gaunt torso, but its skin was translucent, and faint blue veins spiderwebbed beneath it. Water streamed off its slick, hairless head, and its eyes, milky white and unblinking, glowed faintly like the light that had drawn her in. It opened its mouth, revealing rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. But it didn't speak. It hissed, a long, guttural sound that seemed to echo inside her skull. Serena raised the flare gun, her hands shaking. "Stay back!" she shouted, but her voice wavered. The creature tilted its head, studying her. Then slowly it raised one clawed finger and pointed behind her. Her blood ran cold. She turned, and her breath hitched. The water around the boat was glowing now, not just in one place, but all around her. Pulsing lights moved under the surface, circling her vessel like predators herding prey. Shadows darted through the depths, many shadows, too many to count. The creature lunged. Serena pulled the trigger instinctively. The flare erupted with a blinding red flash, slamming into the creature's chest. It screeched, an inhuman wail that pierced her ears as it toppled backward into the water. The impact jolted her into action. She scrambled to the controls, gunning the engine. The boat roared to life, lurching forward. As she sped away, the glowing lights in the water followed, keeping pace effortlessly. She glanced over her shoulder and saw them rising closer to the surface. Then, with a sickening crack, the boat lurched violently. Something had grabbed the hull. The engine sputtered and died. Serena staggered, falling hard onto the deck. The water boiled around her as the lights closed in. She crawled to the edge and peered over, her heart pounding. Dozens of hands, webbed, skeletal, and impossibly strong, were gripping the sides of the boat. And from below, dozens of glowing eyes stared back at her. Serena's breathing was ragged as she grabbed the oar lying on the deck. Her mind raced. Reason with them, fight them off, number. They want to drag me down. She swung the oar at the hands gripping the railing, her strikes landing with dull thuds. The creatures didn't flinch. Their hands tightened, and the metal groaned as they began pulling the boat downward. "No, no, no!" Serena screamed, dropping the oar and scrambling toward the life raft. She tore the cover open, her trembling hands fumbling with the release cord. A splash. She froze. Slowly she turned to see one of the creatures climbing aboard. Its wet, translucent skin glistened in the dim moonlight. Water pooled around its feet as it moved toward her, its glowing eyes locked onto hers. Serena backed away, her heel catching on the edge of the boat. She wobbled but steadied herself. Her hand brushed the flare gun on the deck. She snatched it up and aimed. The creature paused, tilting its head again in that unnervingly slow, curious manner. It opened its mouth, but instead of hissing, it spoke. "You belong," it rasped, its voice a garbled mix of tones that didn't sound entirely human. "What?" Serena stammered, her finger trembling on the trigger. "You belong below," it repeated, stepping closer. The lights under the water flared brighter, illuminating the depths. Serena's eyes widened. Through the glowing haze, she saw structures, tall, jagged spires that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. They stretched endlessly into the darkness, and at their base, something moved. No, not moved, shifted. A mass of writhing, coiling shadows, too enormous to comprehend. Her stomach turned as the boat tipped further. Water lapped at her boots. "You can't take me!" she screamed, firing the flare gun again. The creature dodged with inhuman speed, the flare grazing its arm. It shrieked, but instead of retreating, it lunged at her. Its claws swiped at her leg, tearing through fabric and skin. Serena screamed in pain, kicking wildly. The life raft. She twisted around and grabbed the release cord, yanking it with all her strength. The raft hissed as it inflated, its bright orange form unfurling like a lifeline. Before she could climb in, a hand clamped around her ankle. Serena screamed again, kicking desperately. The creature's grip tightened, and it began pulling her toward the edge of the boat. The other hands gripped the sides harder, tipping the boat further. Serena's body slid toward the water, her fingers clawing at the slick deck. The last thing she saw before the boat capsized was the glowing city below, waiting to claim her. Serena's world flipped as the boat capsized, plunging her into the icy water. The salt burned her wound, and panic surged through her as she flailed for the surface. The glow of the creatures illuminated the dark sea around her, casting eerie, dancing shadows. Their shapes were everywhere, grasping, swimming, circling. The life raft bobbed on the water just a few feet away, its bright orange color a beacon of hope. She kicked toward it with all her strength, her arms cutting through the water in frantic strokes. A cold, slimy hand closed around her ankle. "No!" she screamed, bubbles escaping her mouth as she thrashed. She twisted, her other leg lashing out, catching the creature in the face. It hissed and recoiled, its glowing eyes narrowing. Serena surged upward, breaking the surface with a gasp. The raft was closer now, but so were the creatures. She could see them just beneath the surface, their pale forms darting like sharks. Grabbing the edge of the raft, she pulled herself up with a strength she didn't know she had. Her arms screamed in protest, but she refused to let go. One creature burst from the water, clawing at her side, but she twisted and kicked it back down. Finally, with one last desperate heave, she collapsed onto the raft, panting and shaking. She fumbled for the knife stashed in the emergency kit, her fingers numb from the cold. The creatures began circling the raft, their glowing eyes breaking the surface like eerie lanterns. They slapped the sides, testing its stability. "You can't have me," Serena growled through gritted teeth, clutching the knife. But the creatures didn't attack. Instead, they stopped, bobbing motionlessly around her. One by one, their glowing eyes turned downward. Serena's chest tightened. She leaned over the side, knife ready, and peered into the water. The glow beneath her was growing brighter, spreading out like a massive, bioluminescent bloom. The currents shifted, pulling the raft slowly toward the center of the light. "No, no, no," she whispered, her voice trembling. She grabbed the paddle and began rowing furiously, but it was like fighting against a tide. The raft inched forward, no matter how hard she struggled. Beneath her, the shapes began to emerge. The spires were clearer now, impossibly tall and jagged, their surfaces covered in strange, pulsing patterns. And then she saw it. The shadow in the center of the glowing city began to rise. It was vast, its form shifting like smoke trapped underwater. Dozens of glowing eyes flickered open across its surface, each larger than her entire raft. A deep, resonant hum vibrated through the water, through the raft, and into her bones. The creatures around her began to dive, disappearing one by one into the depths, as if paying homage to the thing below. The light was blinding now, and the current grew stronger. Serena's grip on the paddle faltered, and her thoughts spiraled. She couldn't fight this. She couldn't escape it. And yet, she screamed into the void, "I'm not yours!" Her words echoed into the cold, empty night. Serena's hands trembled as she tore open the emergency kit, scattering its contents across the floor of the raft. A flare gun, a signal mirror, water rations, none of it seemed enough. The raft rocked violently as the pull from below grew stronger. She could feel it now, a low vibration resonating through the thin rubber walls, as if the water itself was alive, breathing, waiting. "There's got to be something, anything," she muttered through clenched teeth, rummaging deeper. Her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. A survival knife? No. Her hand emerged clutching a small, waterproof emergency radio. For a brief moment, hope flickered in her chest. She flipped it on, her fingers frantically tuning the dials. The device hissed with static, the white noise drowning out the eerie hum beneath her. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Serena Matthews. I'm stranded at sea. My boat has capsized and—" Her voice cracked as she glanced over the edge of the raft at the glowing abyss. "There's something in the water. Please, anyone, respond." The static crackled, then stuttered. For a moment it was silent, and Serena's heart raced. Was someone there? And then a voice. "Serena." Her blood turned to ice. The voice wasn't human. It was low, distorted, and rippled like sound passing through water. She dropped the radio in horror, staring at it as the voice continued. "You are already ours. You cannot escape." "No!" she shouted, kicking the radio away. It landed with a splash in the water, sinking into the glowing depths. The raft jolted, nearly tipping her over. The glow beneath her intensified, bathing everything in a sickly blue light. The current dragged the raft faster now, pulling her toward the massive shadow rising from the deep. Frantic, Serena grabbed the flare gun and loaded another cartridge. Her mind raced. Could it burn underwater? Could she aim it into the center of whatever that was? Her fingers tightened around the gun. "If I go down, I'm not going alone." She aimed for the brightest point beneath her, the shadow's core, where the spires seemed to converge. But just as she pulled the trigger, the raft lurched violently. Her shot went wide, the flare streaking into the water harmlessly. "No!" she screamed, fumbling to reload, but her hands slipped. The flare gun fell into the water, disappearing instantly. The vibration in the raft turned to a deep, rhythmic pounding, like a heartbeat. The shadow below shifted, and Serena's vision blurred. Was it the water, or was she being pulled apart, piece by piece? Her hand brushed something else in the emergency kit. She grabbed it blindly, her vision swimming. It was a heavy, cylindrical object, a canister labeled survival beacon, high intensity. Her mind snapped into focus. This could work. She twisted the cap, and the beacon roared to life, emitting a piercing, high-frequency sound. The glow around her pulsed erratically, and the current wavered. The shadow below recoiled, its many glowing eyes blinking in unison. The creatures circling the raft hissed and thrashed, retreating from the sound. For the first time, Serena saw fear in their movements. The high-pitched wail of the survival beacon echoed across the vast, dark sea. Serena gripped the canister with all her strength, the vibrations tingling in her hands, sending a wave of relief through her body. The creatures began to thrash violently, their glowing eyes darting in every direction, no longer approaching the raft. The hum from beneath the surface grew erratic, distorted, as if the shadowy entity in the depths recoiled from the sound. Serena's heart pounded in her chest, but the brief respite wasn't enough. She had no time to waste. With one last glance at the terrifying shapes circling the raft, she grabbed the paddle and began rowing with frantic desperation. The raft lurched and bucked against the waves, its stability now shaky as the creatures struggled to approach. The shadow under the water was still there, growing larger with every passing second. But now it seemed uncertain, its immense form shifting, as if repelled by the beacon's signal. Her arms burned as she dug the paddle into the water, pushing herself further from the epicenter of the glowing lights. The current fought back, but she fought harder, her focus razor sharp. The creatures were still circling, their haunting, luminous forms bobbing in the water like malevolent lanterns. But the beacon had thrown them off, at least for now. Come on, Serena muttered, teeth gritted as she rowed. Every instinct screamed at her to keep going, to get as far away as possible from whatever was lurking below. The water around her seemed to calm, the pulsing glow fading slightly. Serena could feel the tension in the air begin to lift, but the faintest trace of dread lingered in the pit of her stomach. Just when she thought she might be free, a sudden chill swept over her, and she froze. The current had shifted. She glanced over her shoulder. The glow was returning, brighter and more intense than before. The creatures were gathering again, their eyes burning in the water like fireflies. The shadow beneath her was not retreating. It was advancing. Panic surged in Serena's chest. The beacon's high-frequency pulse was still echoing across the water, but the shadow was pushing forward, as if it had grown accustomed to the sound. The pulse wasn't enough anymore. "Why isn't it working?" she gasped, still paddling furiously. The raft felt like it was drifting back toward the very heart of the terror she had tried to escape. And then she saw it. The first tendril. A long, twisted limb of dark matter reached out from beneath the water, coiling through the depths toward her. It was impossibly large, its surface covered in spiny, jagged ridges that seemed to hum with a low, guttural growl. Before Serena could react, the tendril whipped toward the raft. She barely managed to dodge as it lashed across the side, its force knocking the paddle from her hands. The raft spun wildly, nearly capsizing again. Desperation flooded her veins. She reached for anything she could find, but the paddle was lost. The shadow had found her. Serena's breath was shallow, the cold air biting at her skin as her eyes darted around the raft, desperate for anything to use. The tendril had retracted for a moment, but she could feel its presence, like the deep thrum of a distant heartbeat, echoing through the water. Her fingers closed around the survival knife, the metal gleaming in the faint light of the beacon. She gripped it with white-knuckled force, staring down at the shadow that was pulling itself closer, inch by inch, through the depths. The creature's glowing eyes surrounded her again, their movements swift and chaotic as the tendril surged closer. A dark, twisting monstrosity that seemed to stretch endlessly into the abyss below. "No," Serena muttered through clenched teeth. She had no time to question how or why she was here, no time to wonder whether it was hopeless. She could either fight or die. There was no other option. She reached into the kit again, her hands trembling, and pulled out the flare gun. One shot. That's all she had left. But maybe, just maybe, it could buy her enough time. Without hesitation, Serena aimed the flare gun toward the writhing darkness beneath her. Her heart raced as she squeezed the trigger. The flare shot out, streaking through the air, and plunged into the water, illuminating the dark, twisting tendril. The explosion of light was blinding, casting long shadows across the raft. For a moment, the sea seemed to freeze. Everything held its breath. The tendril jerked back with a high-pitched, inhuman screech. The flare had struck it directly, sending a shockwave of light into the depths. But it wasn't enough to stop the creature. It had only been momentary. The flare fizzled out, the glow fading as quickly as it had come, leaving the sea to fall back into a chilling, suffocating silence. But Serena was not done. She had one final trick left, the knife. With a sharp motion, she plunged the blade into the raft's side, scraping the rubber, making a deep gash. At first, nothing happened, but then the raft groaned. It began to tilt, leaning to the side, as if something was pulling from below. She felt it again, the sharp, relentless pull of the abyss beneath her. No! Serena's pulse hammered in her ears as she realized the creature was no longer just toying with her. It was dragging her down. The tendril coiled around the raft's base, pulling tighter with each passing second. Her arms screamed in agony as she fought against it, digging her hands into the raft's torn edge, trying to keep herself afloat. But she could feel herself losing the fight. The raft was sinking slowly, the water creeping higher, the glow intensifying beneath her, wrapping around the raft like an endless, inescapable force. She had only one option left. One final act of desperation. In a single panicked motion, Serena swung the survival knife, cutting the remaining rope that tethered the beacon to the raft. She aimed for the water below, and with a guttural scream, threw the beacon into the depths. The instant it hit the water, the air seemed to crack with a violent energy. The shadow beneath her recoiled with such force that the water surged, pulling everything around her into a whirlpool of chaos. The tendrils retracted, the glowing eyes blinked out, and the creatures scattered into the deep, their shrill cries echoing in the distance. The water surged one last time, and Serena felt the raft lurch violently. She was thrown backward, her grip lost, and she plunged into the freezing, suffocating dark. Serena's body was heavy, the weight of the water pressing in from every direction as she descended deeper into the ocean's heart. Her lungs burned from the lack of air, her limbs numb and sluggish from the freezing cold. The last sliver of light, the flare's brief burst, was gone, swallowed by the crushing darkness. She could barely see her hands in front of her face. The water now, a thick, suffocating black that seemed to stretch on for eternity. Her heart pounded in her chest, its frantic rhythm the only thing left tethering her to the world above. She kicked her legs, trying to rise, but the pull of the deep was too powerful. The tendrils, the creatures, they were no longer part of her world. They were now merely whispers in the blackness, fleeting memories of something far worse. Serena's mind screamed for her to fight, to swim to the surface, but every instinct in her body told her it was useless. The cold had already begun to seep into her bones, making her feel as if she were a part of the water, a permanent fixture of the sea. A deep, insidious sensation wrapped around her, the growing sense that she was not alone, not in a physical sense, but in a much deeper, more ancient way. As the seconds stretched into eternity, the ocean seemed to reach out to her, welcoming her into its depths. Her eyes fluttered closed, her body growing numb. But just as her final breath escaped her lips, something shifted beneath her. A dark shape, vast and incomprehensible, surged through the depths. It was not a creature of flesh or bone, but something far older, something woven from the very fabric of the ocean itself. It was the abyss, not a mere force of nature, but an ancient consciousness, an all-consuming, eternal entity. Serena felt its presence before she saw it, a weight in her mind, a coldness that wrapped around her like chains. It was watching her, feeling her, pulling her into its embrace. The pull of the sea intensified, and she had no choice but to surrender. Her limbs grew heavier, as if the very water itself was trying to crush her. But then, it wasn't the water that was pushing her down. It was the abyss, the consciousness taking her. The sea was no longer an environment she could fight. It was an extension of the entity itself. A whisper, faint at first, then louder, filled her mind. "You are mine now." The words echoed in her mind as the coldness pressed in around her. It wasn't a voice she could recognize, but it felt ancient, like something that had been waiting, watching, for far longer than she could comprehend. Her body jerked, but the darkness held her, drawing her closer to the core of the ocean. The more she fought, the more she sank, until all her struggles ceased. The darkness became her world, and the water became her grave. And then, it was over.